In 2021, a document surfaced in a leaked trove of financial records that stopped analysts cold. It showed that a small group of the world's wealthiest individuals, fewer than 25 people, had, over the preceding decade, quietly transferred more than $1 trillion in assets out of conventional financial systems, not into other banks, not into other investment vehicles, into structures so novel, so legally complex, and so deliberately opaque that existing regulatory frameworks had no clear mechanism for even categorizing them, let alone monitoring them. Not offshore accounts, not shell companies, something newer, something that the architects of 20th century financial regulation had never imagined, because it didn't exist yet when those regulations were written. And that is precisely the point. The ultra-wealthy are not simply hiding money in the old ways. They are doing something far more ambitious and far more consequential. They are systematically building alternative structures of power, capital accumulation, and social organization that exist alongside, and increasingly above, the nation-state frameworks that have governed global society for the past 3 centuries. They are not withdrawing from the world. They are building a new one: parallel legal systems, parallel currencies, parallel cities, parallel scientific research ecosystems, parallel social contracts, all of it designed and funded by a group of individuals whose combined wealth now exceeds the GDP of most of the world's nations, and whose ambitions, as we are about to see, extend considerably further than any previous generation of the wealthy has dared to reach. This is the final video in our Old Money series, and in some ways it is the most important, because it is not about the past. It is about what is being built right now, in real time, by people with the resources to build almost anything they can imagine. Pay very close attention. How wealth concentration reached escape velocity. To understand what the ultra-wealthy are building, we first need to understand how the concentration of wealth reached a level that makes this kind of construction possible. Because the scale of wealth at the top of the global distribution is not merely larger than it has been historically, it is categorically different. And that categorical difference changes what is possible. Let's put some numbers on this. In 2023, the combined wealth of the world's 10 richest individuals exceeded $1.5 trillion. The GDP of Australia, a wealthy developed nation of 26 million people, is approximately $1.7 trillion. 10 human beings control resources approaching the annual economic output of an entire continent. The wealth of the Forbes 400, the 400 richest Americans, has grown from approximately $300 billion in 1994 to over $4.5 trillion in 2023. Adjusted for inflation, that represents a real wealth increase of more than 1,000% in 30 years, during a period when median American household wealth grew by approximately 20% in real terms. Oxfam's annual wealth inequality research, published each year at the Davos World Economic Forum, has consistently documented what economists call a wealth-income divergence, the growing gap between the rate of return on capital, which benefits the wealthy, and the rate of economic growth, which determines income growth for workers. Thomas Piketty's formula R greater than G, the return on capital consistently exceeds economic growth, describes a mathematical engine that produces, over time, ever-increasing concentration of wealth at the top of the distribution. But 3 specific events in the 21st century accelerated this concentration to a degree that changed the game entirely. the 2008 financial crisis and its aftermath. The 2008 global financial crisis and the policy response to it, quantitative easing, near-zero interest rates, and the bailout of financial institutions had a specific and well-documented distributional effect. It dramatically inflated the value of financial assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, while doing relatively little for wage growth or employment income. People who owned financial assets became significantly wealthier. People who depended on wage income did not. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from approximately $900 billion before 2008 to over $9 trillion at its peak in 2022. Money that flowed primarily through financial markets and into the hands of those who owned them. The technology platform concentration. The emergence of platform-based technology businesses, Google, Apple, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, produced a form of wealth concentration that had no precedent in economic history. Platform businesses exhibit what economists call network effects and winner-take-all dynamics. The more users a platform has, the more valuable it becomes, and the harder it is for competitors to displace it. The result was the rapid accumulation of wealth at a pace and scale that previous generations of the wealthy could not have imagined. Jeff Bezos built more wealth in 25 years than the Vanderbilts, Carnegies, and Rockefellers combined managed in their entire lifetimes. Elon Musk's net worth grew by more than $100 billion in a single year, 2020, during a global pandemic. The COVID-19 acceleration. The COVID-19 pandemic and the policy responses to it produced the single largest transfer of wealth in modern history. As lockdowns crushed small businesses, large corporations and technology platforms thrived. Central banks responded to the economic disruption with unprecedented monetary stimulus, further inflating financial asset values. The result, according to Forbes, the world's billionaires grew their combined wealth by $5 trillion, roughly 54%, between March 2020 and November 2021. In less than 2 years. The significance of this wealth concentration is not merely distributional, though the distributional consequences are profound and genuinely troubling. The significance is structural. It has created, for the first time in human history, a group of private individuals whose financial resources are sufficient to undertake projects previously only possible for nation-states. Space programs, pandemic response systems, global communication infrastructure, urban development, scientific research at the frontier of human knowledge, energy infrastructure. These are no longer the exclusive domain of governments. They are now within the reach of private individuals, and those individuals are using that reach systematically, deliberately, and with an ambition that most political commentary has not yet fully grasped. The new geography, private cities, charter cities, and sovereign spaces. The most visible and the most radical way in which the ultra-wealthy are restructuring power for the 21st century is geographical. They are building new places to live that exist outside or alongside existing national jurisdictions. Places where the rules are written by private actors rather than democratic governments. This is not a fringe phenomenon. It is a well-funded, actively developing movement with projects on every continent and a coherent ideological framework supporting it. The Charter City Movement, the intellectual foundation for the private city movement, was laid, perhaps unexpectedly, by a Nobel Prize-winning economist. Paul Romer, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2018 for his work on economic growth, developed the concept of charter cities in a landmark 2009 TED Talk and subsequent academic work. Roemer's argument was elegant and provocative. The primary reason poor countries remain poor is not lack of capital or labor, but lack of good rules, the legal and institutional infrastructure that enables economic activity. If you could create a new city with good rules from scratch, on territory with underdeveloped land, you could demonstrate the power of good governance and potentially transform regional economies. The concept attracted enormous attention and significant private funding. It also attracted enormous controversy. Critics argued it was a form of neo-colonialism, with wealthy Western investors effectively writing the rules for territories in developing countries. The most advanced implementation of something like the charter city concept is Prospera on the Honduran island of Roatan. Prospera operates under a special economic zone framework established by the Honduran government in 2013, though subsequently challenged legally, that gives the zone's administrators extraordinary autonomy. The ability to write their own laws, establish their own court system, set their own tax rates, and operate independently of most Honduran national regulation. Prospera has attracted venture capital, tech entrepreneurs, medical tourism operators, and residents from around the world, all drawn by the promise of a jurisdiction where the rules are written with economic freedom as the primary design criterion. The ideological alignment between Prospera's founders and the libertarian-leaning tech billionaire community is not accidental. Prospera received backing from investors, including Peter Thiel's Founders Fund and Marc Andreessen's a 16Z, two of Silicon Valley's most influential venture capital firms. The investment thesis is not merely financial, it is political, a demonstration that private governance can outperform democratic governance as an engine of economic and social organization. Neom and the state-backed private utopia. In Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is spending an estimated $500 billion to build Neom, a planned city in the desert that includes the line, a 170-kilometer linear city with no cars, no streets, and a completely self-contained urban ecosystem powered by renewable energy. Neom is state-funded rather than privately financed, but it represents the same underlying impulse, the construction of a new place with new rules, designed from scratch with technology and private enterprise at its center, free from the accumulated constraints of existing urban infrastructure and regulation. Whether Neom is built as envisioned, the project has faced significant skepticism from architects and urban planners. It represents the ambitions of a new class of sovereign actors, whether state or private, who are no longer willing to work within existing urban and regulatory frameworks. The seasteading movement and floating sovereignty. The most radical version of the private geography movement is seasteading, the construction of permanent, self-governing communities on international waters, outside the territorial jurisdiction of any nation-state. The Seasteading Institute, founded in 2008 with funding from Peter Thiel, has spent more than a decade developing the technical, legal, and political frameworks for permanent oceanic settlements. The vision is explicit: in international waters beyond the 200-mile exclusive economic zones of coastal nations, a floating settlement could establish its own legal and political framework, free from any existing government's authority. Progress has been slower than the Institute's founders hoped. The legal, engineering, and financial challenges are formidable. But the underlying interest has not diminished. Oceanics, a company backed by UN Habitat and Samsung, has developed detailed plans for floating city districts. Blue Frontiers, a spin-off of the Seasteading Institute, secured an agreement with French Polynesia in 2017 to pilot a floating community within its territorial waters, though the project has since stalled. The New Zealand escape hatch. While some of the ultra-wealthy are building new places, others are securing positions in existing places that offer strategic advantages, particularly in scenarios of global instability. New Zealand has emerged as the preferred escape hatch for a significant number of ultra-high net worth individuals from the United States, Europe, and Asia. Its geographic isolation, stable democratic government, low population density, high agricultural self-sufficiency, and distance from the geopolitical fault lines of the Northern Hemisphere make it an attractive option for wealthy individuals thinking about what geopolitical researchers call tail risk, low probability, catastrophic scenarios. A 2018 investigation by The New Yorker documented the extraordinary concentration of doomsday preparedness investment among Silicon Valley billionaires: private bunkers, private islands, private airstrips, private farms. Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn, estimated at the time that more than 50% of Silicon Valley billionaires had made some form of apocalypse insurance investment. Peter Thiel became a New Zealand citizen in 2011, despite having visited the country only briefly, raising significant questions about the mechanism by which his citizenship was granted. Subsequent reporting revealed that wealthy foreign nationals had been able to obtain New Zealand citizenship through discretionary processes not available to ordinary applicants. The pattern reveals something important. The ultra-wealthy are not merely diversifying their financial portfolios. They are diversifying their geopolitical exposure, maintaining optionality across multiple jurisdictions, multiple legal systems, and multiple physical locations in a way that insulates them from the political risks that affect people who are bound to a single nation. The space economy, when private capital goes vertical. In 1969, the United States government, the most powerful nation-state in human history at the time, put 2 human beings on the moon. The cost was approximately $25 billion, representing about 4% of U.S. GDP at the peak of funding. It required the combined effort of 400,000 engineers, scientists, and technicians, and the full political capital of a wartime-scale national mobilization. In 2023, Elon Musk's SpaceX, a private company, launched more rockets than every government space program on Earth combined. It has built and deployed a constellation of over 5,000 satellites that provides internet service to more than 60 countries. It has secured contracts to return humans to the moon. Contracts issued by NASA because NASA no longer has the capability to do it itself. The privatization of space is not a story about the future. It is happening now, and its implications for the restructuring of power in the 21st century are staggering and almost entirely under-discussed in mainstream political and financial commentary. The resource dimension. The first and most concrete dimension of space privatization is resources. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter contains metallic asteroids whose mineral content, by some estimates, exceeds the total mineral wealth of the entire Earth's surface. A single metallic asteroid, 16 Psyche, which NASA is currently studying, is estimated to contain iron, nickel, and precious metals worth approximately $10 quintillion. That is $10 quintillion, more than 1 million times the current global GDP. These numbers are, in practice, somewhat meaningless. The infrastructure required to extract and transport these resources doesn't exist yet, and the economic frameworks for valuing them are entirely speculative. But they illustrate the scale of potential resource access that space represents. The 2015 U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act was a pivotal moment in this story. The act explicitly grants U.S. citizens and companies the right to own resources extracted from space, asteroids, the moon, other celestial bodies. The resources themselves cannot be owned. The Outer Space Treaty prohibits national claims to celestial bodies, but the extracted materials can be. Companies including Planetary Resources, funded by Larry Page and Eric Schmidt of Google, among others, and Deep Space Industries were established specifically to develop asteroid mining technology. Both companies have since been absorbed or wound down. The technical challenges remain formidable, but the legal and commercial framework they were working toward remains in place. The communication dimension, Starlink and information sovereignty. The most immediately consequential space privatization story is not asteroid mining. It is Starlink. SpaceX's Starlink constellation provides high-speed internet access from low Earth orbit to any location on Earth, including locations where terrestrial internet infrastructure doesn't exist, has been destroyed, or has been controlled and censored by authoritarian governments. The geopolitical implications are already visible. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Ukrainian forces were able to maintain communication and coordinate military operations, in part because Elon Musk provided Starlink terminals to Ukraine. A unilateral decision by a private individual that had direct military consequences in a geopolitical conflict between nation-states. The incident revealed something that political scientists are still processing. A single private individual, controlling a private communication infrastructure, made a decision that affected the outcome of a war. Not a government, not an international organization, a private actor. This is genuinely unprecedented. Communication infrastructure, the roads and rails of the information economy, has historically been controlled by either nation-states, government-owned telecom monopolies, or by regulated private companies operating within national frameworks. Starlink exists partly outside that framework. Its infrastructure is in orbit, subject to no nation's territorial jurisdiction. Its decisions are made by its founder, according to his own judgment. Later in the Ukraine conflict, Musk temporarily restricted Starlink service in certain areas of Ukraine, apparently to prevent its use in a drone attack on the Russian fleet in Crimea. Again, a decision with direct military consequences, made unilaterally by a private individual, with no accountability to any government, any international body, or any democratic process. This is not a criticism of Musk's specific decisions. It is an observation about the structural reality. Private control of critical infrastructure creates private power over consequential decisions that were previously the exclusive domain of states. The planetary escape dimension. Beyond resources and communications, there is the longest-term and most radical dimension of the space privatization story. The possibility of permanent human settlement beyond Earth. Elon Musk has been explicit and consistent about his primary motivation for building SpaceX, making humanity a multi-planetary species as a form of existential insurance. If Earth becomes uninhabitable through climate change, nuclear war, pandemic, asteroid impact, or any of the other scenarios that populate the literature on existential risk, a self-sustaining human settlement on Mars would preserve the human species. This sounds like science fiction. It is a serious engineering and business plan with real capital behind it. SpaceX has invested billions in Starship, the fully reusable super heavy rocket that Musk believes is capable of transporting the volume of cargo and passengers necessary for Mars colonization. The timelines are ambitious and consistently slip, but the direction is consistent and the investment is real. The political dimension of Mars colonization is one that almost nobody is discussing seriously, but that has profound implications. A self-sustaining settlement on Mars would exist outside the jurisdiction of any nation-state. It would need to develop its own legal and political framework, and the people who fund and build that settlement will have decisive influence over what that framework looks like. Musk has addressed this directly. In 2021, SpaceX's Starlink terms of service for Mars explicitly stated that the settlement would recognize no Earth-based government authority and would instead be governed by self-governing principles. A private company, in a terms of service document, was laying the legal groundwork for a sovereign human settlement on another planet. The technology layer, AI, biotech, and the control of what comes next. Geography and space are visible, physical dimensions of the ultra-wealthy's power restructuring. But the most consequential restructuring is happening in a dimension that is almost entirely invisible to most people: the control of transformative technology. The ultra-wealthy are not merely investing in transformative technology. They are systematically funding, directing, and in some cases, personally building the technologies that will define the distribution of power in the 21st century. And they are doing it in ways that give them structural advantages in controlling what those technologies do and who benefits from them. Artificial intelligence. The race to own the future. Artificial intelligence is the most consequential technology currently under development, a general-purpose technology with the potential to transform every sector of the economy, every institution of society, and every dimension of human experience. The development of AI is almost entirely in private hands. The leading AI research institutions, OpenAI, DeepMind, owned by Alphabet, Anthropic, Meta AI, xAI, are either private companies, subsidiaries of private companies, or nonprofit organizations funded primarily by private individuals and corporations. The U.S. government's AI research budget, while substantial, is a fraction of what the private sector is spending. By some estimates, the leading private AI labs are each spending more on AI research annually than the entire U.S. government's civilian AI research budget. This matters because AI is not merely a technology, it is an infrastructure. Whoever controls the most capable AI systems controls a lever over economic productivity, information generation, decision-making processes, and eventually, if the most ambitious predictions are correct, scientific research itself. The concentration of AI development in private hands, among a small number of extraordinarily well-capitalized actors, creates a scenario in which the most powerful technology in human history is being built by people accountable to shareholders and founders rather than to democratic publics. Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, has been candid about the stakes. He has described AGI, artificial general intelligence, an AI system capable of performing any cognitive task a human can, as potentially the most transformative and potentially dangerous technology in human history. He has also presided over the development of the systems he believes will produce it in a private company backed by billions in private capital. The governance frameworks for AI, who decides what these systems can do, whose values they encode, how their economic benefits are distributed, are being written right now, primarily by private actors, the founders and funders of AI companies, not by governments, not by international bodies, not by democratic processes. Biotechnology, the longest bet. If AI is the technology of the next decade, biotechnology is the technology of the next century, and the ultra-wealthy are funding its development with a focus that reflects their multi-generational time horizon. The most significant long-term biotechnology investment being made by the ultra-wealthy is in longevity research, the scientific effort to slow or reverse the biological processes of aging. Jeff Bezos and Yuri Milner have funded Altos Labs, a company focused on cellular reprogramming, the science of resetting biological cells to a younger state. Altos Labs has attracted some of the world's leading aging scientists and has reportedly raised more than $3 billion. Peter Thiel has funded the SENS Research Foundation, which approaches aging as an engineering problem, a set of specific molecular and cellular damages that can, in principle, be repaired. Thiel has been remarkably direct about his personal motivation. He does not want to die, and he is funding science to prevent it. Larry Ellison, founder of Oracle and one of the world's wealthiest individuals, has donated more than $430 million to aging research over his career, making him one of the largest private funders of geroscience in history. The implications of successful longevity extension are, depending on your perspective, either the most wonderful or the most troubling development imaginable. If the treatments work, if it becomes possible to significantly extend healthy human lifespan, who will have access to them? In the near term, the answer is almost certainly the wealthy. Treatments developed in private companies, with private funding, will be priced at levels that reflect their development cost and the willingness to pay of the wealthiest potential customers. The social implications of a world in which the very wealthy live significantly longer than everyone else, accumulating wealth, influence, and power across a biological lifespan measured in centuries rather than decades, are profound and almost incomprehensible within existing social and political frameworks. Inheritance disappears as a wealth distribution mechanism. The generational turnover that has historically refreshed elites slows dramatically. The dynasties we've been studying in this series become, quite literally, immortal. Brain-computer interfaces. The last frontier. Neuralink, Elon Musk's brain-computer interface company, is developing technology that would allow direct communication between the human brain and computational systems. The initial medical applications, restoring function to paralyzed individuals, are unambiguously beneficial. The long-term implications are considerably more complex. A world in which some humans have direct cognitive interfaces with AI systems, enhanced memory, enhanced processing speed, direct access to information networks, and others do not, is a world with a new and potentially irreversible form of cognitive stratification. The ultra-wealthy, who fund this technology and will have first access to it, would gain cognitive advantages that translate directly into economic, social, and political advantages. Brian Johnson, a tech entrepreneur who sold his company to PayPal for $800 million, has spent tens of millions of dollars on his Blueprint longevity protocol, a rigorously documented, scientifically monitored program of diet, exercise, sleep, and supplementation designed to slow his biological aging. He has made his protocol public, positioning himself as a pioneer of what he calls the democratization of longevity. But the full stack of interventions available to someone spending millions per year on personalized medical research is not democratized. It is, by definition, exclusive. The parallel financial system, crypto, DAOs, and private currencies. The ultra-wealthy's restructuring of power is not only geographical, spatial, and technological. It is also financial. A systematic effort to build financial infrastructure that operates outside or alongside the monetary and regulatory systems controlled by nation-states. This is perhaps the most sophisticated and the most consequential piece of the power restructuring story. And it is happening at a speed that most governments are struggling to respond to. The original motive: distrust of state money. The philosophical foundation of the parallel financial system movement is a deep, principled distrust of state-controlled money. The argument is not fringe. It is made by serious economists and has historical foundation. When governments control currency, they control the ability to inflate that currency, to print money, diluting the purchasing power of existing monetary assets. The history of the 20th century is full of episodes in which state control of money was used to expropriate wealth from private actors. Hyperinflation in Weimar Germany, currency confiscations in Argentina, forced currency conversions in numerous developing economies. The ultra-wealthy response to this risk has historically been gold, a physical asset outside the monetary system, whose supply cannot be increased by government decree. The wealthiest individuals and families have consistently maintained significant gold holdings as a hedge against currency debasement, a practice that continues today, with central banks themselves holding more than 35,000 metric tons of gold in reserve. Bitcoin represents a digital version of the same impulse, a monetary asset with a fixed supply, outside state control, resistant to confiscation, if properly secured, and globally transferable without reference to any national payment system. The mathematical rules governing Bitcoin's supply are embedded in code and cannot be changed by any government or central bank. The ultra-wealthy relationship with Bitcoin has evolved from curiosity to serious allocation. Paul Tudor Jones, one of America's most respected macro investors, publicly disclosed a Bitcoin position in 2020, describing it as a hedge against what he called the Great Monetary Inflation. Stanley Druckenmiller, another legendary macro investor, made a similar disclosure. The Winklevoss twins, who famously settled their dispute with Mark Zuckerberg for a portion of the early Facebook equity, have built a significant portion of their fortune in Bitcoin. The DAO revolution, private governance at scale beyond currency, the more radical financial innovation is the decentralized autonomous organization. The DAO. A DAO is an organization governed by rules encoded in blockchain smart contracts, rather than by human managers operating within a legal corporate framework. Its governance tokens, digital assets that confer voting rights, can be held by anyone, anywhere, without requiring participation in any national legal system. The most radical vision of the DAO, one held explicitly by many of its most committed advocates, is as a replacement for the nation-state as a governance mechanism. Instead of citizenship and taxation as the basis of social organization, DAOs offer voluntary membership, algorithmic governance, and private property rights enforced by code rather than by courts. The practical implementation has been rocky. Numerous major DAOs have experienced governance failures, fraud, and exploits that revealed the gap between the theory of algorithmic governance and its practice. but the investment flowing into DAO infrastructure from some of the world's most sophisticated venture investors suggests that the early failures are viewed as a learning process rather than a refutation of the concept. Constitution DAO, a DAO formed in 2021 to collectively bid for an original copy of the U.S. Constitution at auction, raised $47 million in less than a week, entirely from small donors, coordinated through Discord and Twitter, with no legal entity, no board of directors, and no physical office. It lost the auction, outbid by hedge fund manager Ken Griffin, but demonstrated the organizational capacity of DAO structures at a speed and scale that no conventional organization could have matched. Stablecoins and the private money supply. The most immediately consequential development in private financial infrastructure is the stablecoin, a digital asset pegged to the value of a traditional currency, usually the US dollar, but operating on blockchain infrastructure outside the conventional banking system. Tether, the largest stablecoin, processes more daily transaction volume than PayPal. USD Coin, issued by Circle, processes trillions in annual transaction volume. These are not speculative assets. They are functioning private currencies, payment infrastructure, that exists outside the regulatory framework designed for banks. The Federal Reserve and the Bank for International Settlements have both identified stablecoin networks as potential systemic risks, precisely because they are large enough to affect the monetary system, but are not subject to the regulatory frameworks that govern conventional financial institutions. The ultra-wealthy are not merely using this infrastructure. They are, in many cases, building and funding it, capturing the economic value of a private monetary system, while the regulatory frameworks for governing it remain undeveloped. The policy capture evolution from lobbying to lawmaking. In our second video in this series, we discussed how old money families have historically captured the institutions that make consequential decisions: university boards, cultural institutions, regulatory bodies. The pattern we're about to describe is a 21st century evolution of that capture, one that is faster, more ambitious, and more direct than anything the old money families of the 20th century attempted. The ultra-wealthy are not merely influencing policy. In specific targeted domains, they are writing it. The think tank industrial complex. The policy influence of privately funded think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Brookings Institution, the Manhattan Institute, and dozens of others across the political spectrum, has been extensively documented. These organizations receive funding from wealthy individuals and corporations, produce research and policy recommendations, and supply personnel to government agencies and administrations. The revolving door between think tanks and government positions has created a policy infrastructure in which the ideas that enter government, the frameworks for thinking about regulation, taxation, international trade, monetary policy, and social organization, are generated, refined, and championed by institutions whose funding reflects the interests of their donors. This is not new. It was true in the 20th century. But in the 21st century, the investment in this infrastructure has scaled dramatically, and the ideological alignment between the ultra-wealthy's interests and the policy outputs of their funded institutions has become more explicit and more direct. A 2019 study by political scientists Alexander Hertel Fernandez, Theda Skocpol, and Jason Sklar, published in Studies in American Political Development, documented how a network of conservative donors organized by Charles and David Koch had spent approximately $400 million per election cycle on a comprehensive policy infrastructure. Not merely campaign contributions, but think tanks, academic programs, judicial training seminars, state policy organizations, and media outlets, designed to shift the entire landscape of policy debate in directions favorable to low-tax, low-regulation economic frameworks. The scale and sophistication of this infrastructure, described by the researchers as a shadow political party, has no historical precedent. It is not lobbying. It is the construction of an alternative policy reality. The regulatory capture escalation. The 21st century has seen the ultra-wealthy pursue regulatory capture with a precision and directness that goes beyond what previous generations attempted. The most striking example is in the technology sector, where the companies built by ultra-wealthy founders have grown to scales that dwarf previous corporate behemoths, and where those companies have mounted systematic campaigns to prevent the regulatory frameworks that might constrain their growth. The European Union's regulatory efforts, the General Data Protection Regulation, the Digital Markets Act, the AI Act, represent the most sustained attempt by any government to establish meaningful rules for the technology platforms. The lobbying expenditure by technology companies in Brussels in response to these efforts has been extraordinary. Meta, Google, Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft collectively spent over 100 million euros on EU lobbying between 2021 and 2023, according to data from the EU Transparency Register. In the United States, the story is different in form, but similar in effect. The Federal Communications Commission's reclassification of broadband as a less regulated service, the Federal Trade Commission's challenged attempts to block major tech mergers, the Securities and Exchange Commission's contested jurisdiction over cryptocurrency. Each of these regulatory battles has seen private capital deployed to shape the rules that would govern it. The judiciary strategy. Perhaps the most sophisticated long-term policy capture strategy of the 21st century is the effort by certain networks of ultra-wealthy donors to shape the federal judiciary, the institution that ultimately determines the constitutional validity of government regulation. The Federalist Society, funded significantly by the Koch network, the Bradley Foundation, and other conservative donors, has spent 40 years building a network of legally trained conservatives who share a specific constitutional philosophy, originalism, that tends to be skeptical of broad regulatory authority. The society has supplied a significant proportion of the federal judiciary, including multiple Supreme Court justices, over this period. The long-term nature of this strategy, a 40-year investment in legal education, judicial pipeline development, and constitutional philosophy, is precisely the kind of multi-generational thinking that we've been documenting throughout this series as characteristic of the most effective power preservation strategies. We are approaching the conclusion of this series, 6 videos, thousands of words, covering everything from what old money considers tacky to what the ultra-wealthy are building for the next century. If this series has been valuable to you, genuinely valuable, the kind of information that changes how you see the world, the most powerful thing you can do right now is share this video, not for the channel, for the people in your life who deserve to understand how power actually works. Share it now, and then come right back for the conclusion. The philanthropy evolution, from charity to system change. In the earlier videos of this series, we discussed charitable foundations as tools of both genuine philanthropy and power maintenance, mechanisms by which old money families shaped cultural priorities, maintained institutional influence, and managed their public narratives. The 21st century has produced a new and more ambitious form of elite philanthropy that goes considerably beyond these functions. It is philanthropy as system design, the explicit attempt to use private wealth to reshape fundamental structures of global society, from public health systems to educational institutions to democratic governance itself. The Gates Foundation and Global Health Governance. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is, by most measures, the most influential private philanthropic organization in human history. With an endowment of approximately $75 billion and annual grant-making of $6 to $7 billion, it is larger than the GDP of many nations and more influential in specific domains than most international organizations. In global public health, the Gates Foundation's funding dwarfs that of most national governments and international organizations. It is the second largest funder of the World Health Organization, after the United States government, giving it extraordinary influence over WHO's research priorities, policy recommendations, and institutional direction. The foundation has been credited with saving millions of lives through its support for vaccine development and distribution, malaria eradication efforts, and polio elimination programs. It has also attracted sustained criticism for the structural implications of its influence. Decisions about global health priorities that affect billions of people are being made significantly by a private foundation accountable to no electorate. The political scientist Lindsay McGoey, in her 2015 book, No Such Thing as a Free Gift, documented this dynamic in detail, arguing that the Gates Foundation's global health influence represented a form of philanthrocapitalism that systematically substituted private judgment for democratic deliberation in domains that should be subject to public accountability. The long-termism movement and existential risk. Perhaps the most intellectually ambitious form of 21st century elite philanthropy is the long-termism movement, a philosophical framework developed primarily at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute and the Center for Effective Altruism, that argues that the most important moral priority for wealthy actors is reducing existential risks that could permanently curtail humanity's long-term potential. The long-termist framework, developed by philosophers Nick Bostrom and William MacAskill and popularized in MacAskill's 2022 book, What We Owe the Future, has attracted significant financial support from the ultra-wealthy, particularly in the technology sector. Sam Bankman-Fried, before his catastrophic fraud-driven collapse, was a prominent effective altruist whose stated motivation for accumulating billions was to give it away to long-termist causes. Dustin Moskovitz, co-founder of Facebook, has donated hundreds of millions to effective altruist organizations through the Open Philanthropy Project. The framework is sophisticated and genuinely well-intentioned. It is also, critics argue, a philosophical justification for concentrating decision-making about humanity's future in the hands of a small group of wealthy, technically sophisticated individuals who have convinced themselves that their judgment about what matters most for the long-term future of the species supersedes the messy, slow, contentious processes of democratic deliberation. Mackenzie Scott and the Counter Model. Against this backdrop, Mackenzie Scott's approach to philanthropy stands out as a genuine alternative model. Since her divorce from Jeff Bezos in 2019, Scott has given away more than $17 billion at a speed and with a methodology that inverts the Gates Foundation model entirely. Rather than building a large institutional apparatus, setting strategic priorities, and funding organizations whose work aligns with those priorities, Scott has given large, unrestricted grants to organizations working at the community level, letting them determine their own priorities rather than imposing hers. She has given to food banks, community colleges, housing organizations, and racial justice groups, deliberately avoiding the kind of strategic philanthropic influence that characterizes the Gates model. Whether Scott's model or the Gates model produces better outcomes is genuinely contested, but the contrast between them illuminates the fundamental question of 21st century elite philanthropy. When private wealth is large enough to reshape public institutions and public policy, whose judgment should govern how that reshaping happens? Let's step back from the details and look at the whole picture. Across this series, we have traced the arc of inherited wealth from its most intimate expressions, the old money distaste for visible logos, the careful education of heirs, the dynasty trusts that span generations, to its largest scale ambitions, private cities, orbital infrastructure, AI systems, and longevity research that could fundamentally alter the biological basis of human equality. What connects all of it is a single, consistent thread: the effort to build structures that are more durable than any individual, more resilient than any market cycle, and more powerful than any political opposition. The old money families we discussed in the early videos of this series built those structures within the frameworks of existing society, using its legal systems, its educational institutions, its cultural organizations, its financial infrastructure. They were powerful actors within a system they did not, on the whole, seek to replace. The 21st century ultra-wealthy, or at least the most ambitious among them, are doing something different. They are building alongside the existing system, in some cases above it, in some cases as an explicit replacement for it. Whether this is good or bad depends enormously on what they build and how they build it. Private space infrastructure that expands humanity's access to resources and ultimately to other planets. Genuinely transformative and potentially wonderful. Private AI systems whose values and priorities are determined by their founders without democratic accountability. Genuinely concerning. Private longevity research that extends healthy human lifespan. Potentially wonderful for those who can access it, potentially catastrophic for social equality if they cannot. Private governance frameworks that offer freedom from bureaucratic obstruction, appealing in theory, deeply troubling in their implications for democratic accountability. The appropriate response to this restructuring of power is neither uncritical enthusiasm nor reflexive hostility. It is clear-eyed understanding of what is being built, by whom, under what constraints, and toward what ends. Because the choice is being made right now, in venture capital boardrooms, in private research labs, in the governance documents of DAOs and charter cities, in the terms of service of AI companies and satellite networks, will shape the distribution of power and possibility in the 21st century for everyone, not just for the people making them, for all of us. The first step toward participating meaningfully in those choices is understanding them. And understanding them is what this entire series has been about. Comment below, of everything we've covered in this video, the private cities, the space economy, the AI race, the longevity research, the parallel financial system, which development do you find most consequential, most alarming, most hopeful? I genuinely want to know where your mind goes. Drop it below. Hit like if this video has been worth your time. Thousands of words, months of research. A single tap tells me it landed. Subscribe and ring the bell. This video is complete, but the channel is not. The next video comes up soon, and if you've made it through, you are exactly the kind of person it's made for. Don't miss it. Share this video with someone who thinks power is simpler than it is. Because it isn't, and the more people who understand that, the better positioned we all are to participate in the decisions that shape what comes next. I will see you in the next one.